Kiara faked enthusiasm through the pin, the penis on the stripper past the cucumber between your legs, and popping inflated condoms with your thighs games. As the hostess of Alice's bridal shower, she had to smile and giggle and pretend that she didn't mind having 12 of Alice's closest friends demolishing a catered high tea in her apartment while chatting nonstop about the wedding. She'd done this out of love for her sister. Which begged the question, how far would she go? Walking out on Ashton last night had been about self-preservation. She'd barely been able to focus on what he'd said as she fantasized about tearing that tux off him. Her need for him was that powerful. Then when he'd suggested she pretend to be his girlfriend for a few weeks, she'd kinda lost it, because Kiara knew there'd be little pretense. Thankfully, he'd given her the time she'd asked for, not to think about what she wanted in return, but to prove she never jumped to any guy's tune. Pretending to be his girlfriend for a few weeks would have physical benefits that would be more than enough as retribution. She'd tell him her decision when he dropped by later tonight, giving her plenty of time to usher out the bride-to-be and her drunk cronies. In a surprisingly painless and quick maneuver, she emptied her apartment, though Alice hadn't drunk as much as her friends. "Are you expecting company?" she asked, leaning in to hug Kiara. "Maybe," Kiara said, nudging her sister out the door. "Now go. Have fun." Alice brandished a huge cutout cardboard penis she'd taken from the game earlier. "I know I will when I measure Greg's next to this. Too much information." "Bye." Kiara laughed as she slammed the door, glad her sis had enjoyed the bridal shower. But a shiver of anticipation was shooting through her at the thought of Ashton's arrival later. Alice wouldn't be the only one having fun tonight. A soft knock sounded at the door, and she wrenched it open, eager to get rid of Alice. But the air whooshed out of her lungs at the sight of Ashton in a designer navy suit, his sky blue tie askew, his top button undone, sporting a smile filled with intent. "You're early," she said, darting a worried glance over his shoulder. "Did you pass Alice?" He nodded. "Yeah, work finished earlier than expected. It threw me for a second seeing her, but I told her we were colluding over our wedding duties and she bought it." "Good." Kiara opened the door wider and waited until he stepped inside before pushing him up against the wall. "I've been thinking about this all day," she said before pressing her mouth to his, sliding her tongue between his lips and sinking into the sensuality of him. He ravaged her mouth in a long, hot, open-mouthed kiss. Skilled and commanding, tender and controlling. Perfect. When his hands slid under her skirt and up the back of her thighs, she hooked a leg around his waist and kicked the door shut. It surprised him, and his mouth eased from hers. "Talented." "You ain't seen nothing yet," she said, nipping at his bottom lip, savoring the flare of heat in his indigo gaze. "You know you said you've been thinking about this all day?" He pressed his hips against hers, and she melted into him, his hardness a wicked promise of things to come. Try all night. He'd given her the perfect segue. "Speaking of last night, thanks for giving me the time I asked for. I thought about it, and it's been too long since I've had some fun, so..." She licked him a teasing swipe of her tongue along his jawline towards his ear. "I'll be your pretend girlfriend for 2 weeks, as long as I can keep doing this." She slid her hand between their bodies and traced the outline of his erection before giving a gentle squeeze. He groaned and picked her up effortlessly, striding towards the sofa, where he set about proving exactly how fantastic it would be to have him as her boyfriend. In his world, everybody had a quid pro quo, so it disconcerted Ashton that Kiara hadn't demanded much in exchange to be his fake girlfriend for the next few weeks. If all went well, he'd get a coveted promotion out of this and all she'd asked him to do after their second sensational bout of sex last night had been to look after Greg and make sure he made it to the wedding on time. An easy task, considering Greg was a complete putz over Alice and way too stable at 24. When he'd been the same age 8 years ago, he'd been partying hard, enjoying a 6-figure salary and the women it attracted in one of the most bustling cities in the world. Then he'd married divorced 14 months later and picked up where he'd left off, taking Melbourne by storm socially. Problem was not much had changed, which was exactly why he'd had to coerce the luscious Kiara into pretending to be his girlfriend. Greg may be staid and a tad boring, but a lot could be said about a guy that age having his head screwed on right. Surprise! Kiara stepped into his office, swinging a cardboard box resembling a picnic basket. Hope you're hungry. Ravenous. They locked gazes across the spacious glass-enclosed space, and he wished that this lunch wasn't about showing off for Elliot and that his office had plaster walls, not glass. She looked incredible in a figure-hugging skirt suit, the color of ripe plums, her hair piled on top of her head, a coy smile playing about her mouth. "You're looking exceptionally beautiful today," he said, standing to cross the room and welcome her with a kiss. He'd intended on making it brief a gesture for show, considering half the management team were surreptitiously watching them from their respective glass offices. But the moment he got close enough to smell her, he lost his head. "I want you so badly," he said, capturing her mouth with a possessiveness that surprised him. There was something infinitely alluring about this confident woman that turned him into a caveman. "Nice to see you too," she said, patting his cheek with one hand while touching her lips with the other, as if she couldn't quite believe he'd done that. He bent his head to murmur in her ear, "I appreciate you stopping by to do this." "Isn't this what all good girlfriends do?" She batted her eyelashes in faux innocence. "Clear an hour off their hectic schedule, forgo that billable hour to play nice with a not-so-nice man." He laughed out loud, drawing blatant stares from nearby offices. He didn't care. This lunch may be pretend, but his attraction to this woman was all too real. "You're something else." He rested his hand on the small of her back, letting it linger a second before sliding lower to caress the curve of her ass. She inhaled sharply, but didn't move as he gave her a light slap before removing his hand to take the cardboard box from her. "Take that as a promise of what's to come," he said, striding swiftly for the safety of his desk, where he could camouflage the evidence of his rampaging desire. "You into spanking now?" She perched on the edge of his desk and crossed her legs. "Because I prefer pleasure to pain, in case you were wondering. I know exactly how to pleasure you." Angling his body toward the desk, he cupped her calf and gave it a squeeze before sliding his palm higher behind her knee, a particularly erogenous zone he'd discovered with his mouth last night. "What's with all the glass?" she muttered as he tickled the soft skin behind her knee. "You could have had me for lunch if you had a proper office, not a Mediterranean focaccia with everything." "I happen to like focaccia," he said, straightening as he glimpsed Elliot hovering near his half-closed door. "And I like you." She leaned forwards, giving him a tantalizing view of impressive cleavage as his boss strode into his office. "Sorry to interrupt," Elliot said, not looking sorry at all, the pompous jerk, as he grinned at Kiara. "But I need you to talk down a jumpy client, Ashton. Now, I wouldn't bust up your cozy lunch if it wasn't important." "That's okay," Kiara said, standing. "Rain check, honey. You bet." Ashton kissed her on the mouth, and as he lingered longer than conventional for a kiss in front of his boss, he knew it had more to do with Kiara than any crazy plan for a promotion. "Bye, Elliot." She raised her hand in a casual wave as they watched her walk out of the office. "That's a fine woman you've got there, Ashton," Elliot said. "Good to see you settling down." Ashton couldn't speak. not because of embarrassment for the charade he was perpetuating, but for the simple fact he agreed too heartily Kiara was a fine woman, and while technically he didn't have her, he was starting to wish he had. Kiara had signed off on her third divorce for the morning and was neck-deep in paperwork when she heard her door close with a click. Annoyed at the intrusion, she glanced up from her desk and froze. "What are you doing here?" Ashton's smile made something in her chest kick, and she didn't like it. "Is that any way to greet your boyfriend after not seeing him for a week?" Kiara didn't know what aggravated her more, the fact she'd missed a guy she barely knew, or the fact she liked the boyfriend label. "I'm busy," she snapped, gesturing to the pile of folders on her desk. "Ouch." He clutched at his heart and sauntered towards her, and her pulse accelerated with every step closer. "You know, I would have gotten out of it if I could, but Elliot insisted I fly to Sydney personally to get that flaky client to sign on the dotted line." "You had urgent work, I get it," she said, standing when he stopped 2 feet away so as not to have him towering over her. "Like what I have now, so please leave." His mouth claimed hers in a searing kiss that left her boneless and clueless as to how to stop this ridiculous yearning she had for him. Strong career women didn't yearn. They kicked ass and came back for seconds. But as his arms swept around her waist and pinned her to him where she could feel exactly how much he'd missed her, she didn't just yearn. She craved with every cell in her body. "We can't do this here." She laid her palms against his chest and pushed away lightly. "Door can't lock." "What is it with us? Too much glass doors that won't lock." He sent a pointed look at his hard-on. "You're seriously cramping my style, babe." She chuckled at his mock, wounded expression. "How about you come to my place tonight around 11? The bachelorette party should be done by then." He rolled his eyes. "You better not be having a stripper." "Now why would I need a lap dance from a buffed, bronzed, gorgeous male specimen when I have you?" She flashed him a sweet smile as she patted his chest in complete condescension. "Want to hear a secret?" He crooked his finger, and she couldn't help but lean in. "I'll do more than give you a lap dance after the bachelorette party." He snagged her hand and pressed it to his groin. "You can count on it." Raising her other hand to his mouth, he pressed a kiss into the palm and curled her fingers over it before releasing her and sauntering towards the door. "One more thing," he said over his shoulder. "What?" "A week is a long time to miss you, so don't plan on sleeping tonight." When the door clicked, Kiara collapsed into her ergonomic chair, reached for the nearest folder, and fanned her face. When the heat subsided, she tapped at her keyboard, brought up the barista's menu at her nearest cafe, and ordered 2 bags of his special roast blend. She planned on ingesting a lot of caffeine so she could be up all night. "What is with you?" Greg elbowed Ash, causing him to spill half his beer. "You look like you want to be anywhere but here." "Ain't that the truth?" Ash thought as he glanced around the nightclub. Usually he loved the exclusivity of this place perched high above Melbourne. The women were A-listers, models, and actresses, mostly who were in it for a good time, not a long time. Tonight, their covetous glances left him cold. "Long day at work." The lie slid easily from his lips as he raised his beer in Greg's direction. "Why are you looking at me? You should be staring at the luscious babes strutting their stuff." Greg practically squirmed. "No offense, bro, but bachelor parties are kind of lame." "It could be worse. I could have taken you to a strip club." Horror widened Greg's eyes. "You're not planning anything after this?" "Relax. We're going to a cigar bar." There was only one woman he wanted to see naked tonight. And after the way she'd got him worked up in her office this afternoon, he hoped it would be sooner rather than later. He hadn't expected to miss her over the last week while he'd been working in Sydney, but he had. She'd sneaked into his thoughts at the oddest of moments, like getting the client to sign over 7 figures to invest. Women never derailed him at work. Kiara wasn't most women. "Do you mind if we call it a night?" Greg gestured at the gyrating bodies on the dance floor. "I appreciate the effort, but this isn't my scene, and I'd rather drop by Alice's than smoke cigars." Ash shrugged, feigning nonchalance when inside he fist-pumped the air. "Sure, I've got places to be too." Ash didn't understand his brother's sly grin. Kiara's, "What the?" "Alice and I know you, doofus." He jabbed him in the chest. "That whole pretending not to know each other when we first introduced you, lame. We saw the sparks between you and the way you stared at each other." "We're friends," he said, hating how hollow that sounded. "You're more than that." Greg snickered. "Elliot told Dad how much he approves of your girlfriend. Dad does too." Hell. When Ash had first come up with the plan to have Kiara pose as his girlfriend to help him secure a promotion, he hadn't envisaged having to explain to his family when they split up. "For what it's worth, we all approve." Greg slapped him on the back. "Kiara's great, so don't mess with her, okay?" Ash managed a terse nod before Greg continued. "And I've never seen you so smitten by a woman either." He winked. "Who knows, you might be the second Cromwell walking down the aisle with a Hastings." Yeah, and Ash would be quitting his job. Never going to happen. Kiara didn't drink often a glass of wine with dinner at a fine restaurant, a flute of champagne to toast at a party, which made the mojito and 2 daiquiris she'd consumed at Alice's bachelorette party tonight responsible for how she greeted Ash. "Get in here and take off your clothes." She hauled Ashton through her door and slammed it shut, eyeballing him and daring him to laugh at her outfit. But he was a smart man, and the only glimmer of amusement she saw happened with the barest quirk of his lips. "That's some dress." His teasing drawl, low and barely above a growl, made her skin prickle with anticipation. "Because Alice is so prim and proper all the time, I made it a naughty not nice theme." She did a little twirl and snagged a heel in her fishnet stockings in the process. "Well, you've certainly managed to stick to the theme well." His eyes glittered as he stared at her sky-high stilettos in a garish crimson, perused his way up her legs, focused on the black lace garter holding up her stockings, and studied the red bustier and matching miniskirt with particular intent. "I thought I was doing the stripping tonight," he said, adding in a pelvic swivel and thrust with a laugh. "You are." She reached for her phone and tapped the music app. Her favorite song of all time played from the surround sound speakers. "Do your thing, gorgeous." She collapsed onto the nearest sofa, placed her feet on the coffee table, interlocked her hands behind her head, and waited. "I'm feeling objectified," he said, his mouth easing into that slow, sexy smile that made her panties damp. "So you're into blues, huh?" "Yeah, now take it all off." Kiara struggled not to salivate as Ashton unbuttoned his shirt while swiveling his hips in time to the music. Strutting from one corner of her lounge room to the other, he flung off his shirt, unbuckled, and whipped out his belt and unsnapped his jeans. Heat pounded through her body in sync with the blues singer's dulcet tones as he strode towards her, stopped a foot away, and lowered his zipper. She couldn't hear the rasp of metal teeth above the music, but she stared at that zipper mesmerized as it slid lower until it could go no further. With his hands on his hips, his cocky grin making her want to clamber all over him, he arched an eyebrow. "Would you give me 10 out of 10 for stripping?" With her skin alight and the insistent throb between her legs intensifying, she scooted forward on the sofa. "Absolutely." She pushed his jeans down his legs, along with his jocks, revealing what she wanted most. "Kiara." She reached for him, anticipation thrumming through her veins. "You can objectify me any time." She proceeded to do exactly that. Ashton didn't take mid-afternoon coffee breaks in cafes decorated with schmaltzy hearts and cupids and other ridiculous Valentine's Day paraphernalia. Then again, he didn't strip to blues or hold hands or have sex in a garden either. But he'd done all that and more with Kiara. He knew he shouldn't be doing this meeting up with her because she'd asked, and because she'd sounded so damn upbeat on the phone that his chest had ached. She made him feel, and he didn't want that. Since when had pretend become real? He barely knew her. They had next to nothing in common besides abhorrence for romance and a penchant for steamy sex. So what happened in 2 days when Greg and Alice tied the knot and the promotion Elliot had hinted at several times became a reality? Kiara would revert to a friend, an acquaintance. Nothing. She breezed into the coffee shop on the ground floor of his office building, her gaze zeroing in on him instantly. The excitement in her eyes served like a kick in the guts, winding him. She looked like that every time she laid eyes on him, and it only served to make him feel lousy for what he had to do. He had to lay the groundwork for their impending breakup, because he felt more for her in 2 weeks than he had in 2 months with Tracy. He'd vowed after his divorce never to get involved in a long-term relationship, and Kiara had him questioning that decision every 5 minutes. Not good. Hey! She greeted him with a kiss on the cheek, and he fought the urge to claim her mouth. Thanks for meeting me. No problem. Liar, his conscience screamed, because sitting across from her, drinking in her glowing skin, her fiery hair, her siren-red power suit, meant breaking up with this woman was the last thing he wanted to do. I know we're both busy, so I'll get straight to the point. Her nose crinkled as she pulled out a folder from her satchel. The bride's in a panic, so she's lumped this duty on us. Ash flicked open the folder, his eyes bombarded with white tulle pink hearts and glitter. What's this? We need to assemble the wedding favors. He bit back a grin at her audible disgust. Isn't that a maid of honor's job? Her glare could have scorched the wall behind him. The best man has to help too. According to whom? Me. She snapped the folder shut. What are you doing tonight? Helping stuff ridiculously small bags with useless rubbish nobody wants. Bingo! She snapped her fingers and picked up her bag, pushing back her chair to stand. Confused by her flyby visit, he said, You could have asked me over the phone, you know. True. She stood and hoisted her satchel onto her shoulder. But then I wouldn't get to do this. She bent to brush a kiss over his lips, lingering long enough for her tongue to sweep over his bottom lip in a slow, tantalizing tease. See you tonight, she whispered in his ear, and then she was gone, leaving him lusting and puzzled and more confused than ever about how he could let her walk out of his life in a few days. Why couldn't we do this at your place? Ashton muttered as he slid another candy heart imprinted with entwined A and G initials into a tulle bag. Because Alice wanted all the wedding paraphernalia at the venue, so nothing could be forgotten on the day. Kiara sighed and slipped a silver keychain into the bag Ash handed her. And if we'd done this at my place, we wouldn't get finished. That's because I'd rather get started, he said, leaning across to nip her earlobe. A shiver of anticipation made her tingle. The faster we get these done, the faster we can get out of here. There's always the garden nook, he murmured, trailing his lips across her jaw to claim her mouth. Ahem. They leapt apart to see Greg grinning in the doorway as his gaze swung between them. I hate to interrupt, but I need you for a second, Ash. He's always had bad timing, Ash muttered, winking before he handed her another tulle bag. Then again, if it gets me out of stuffing any more of these, I'm glad. She rolled her eyes and shooed him away. Go. Kiara sighed in appreciation as she stared at Ash's butt as he walked towards Greg. A few weeks ago, the thought of stuffing delicate candy hearts, silver keychains, and miniature calligraphic thank you notes into tulle bags would have sent her batty. But the last hour had flown while Ash kept her entertained with his signature dry wit. Ouch! She glanced down at her finger where blood welled near the tip. Lost in ogling, she'd slashed it across a thank you note. Paper cuts were the pits. Not wanting to drip all over Alice's white tulle bags, she went in search of a plaster. The guest bathroom had a plethora of emergency supplies, as she'd discovered on her first visit to the mansion. And once she'd bandaged the cut, she headed back to the library and her duties. However, the sound of raised voices, Ash's and Greg's, drew her towards the kitchen.
Stop lying to yourself, man. Shut up, Greg, and back off. Kiara and I are short-term, nothing more. It's ridiculous to pretend otherwise.
Kiara froze ice, trickling through her veins. She'd never eavesdropped, and this was why. Listening to these truths hurt a lot more than they should. Ash had articulated exactly what they'd stipulated at the start. But somewhere along the way, her stupid, well-protected heart had been duped into believing they could be more. Time to toughen up. But first, she swiveled on her heel and made a dash back to the bathroom where she could compose herself before finishing those damn bags and making a strategic exit. The moment Ashton denounced any real feelings for Kiara, he felt like a fool. Like he'd betrayed her somehow.
You're a moron,
Greg said with a shake of his head.
Your feelings for her are written all over your face.
Are not. Are too. Greg poked out his tongue like he used to as an annoying 8-year-old.
There's nothing wrong with falling in love, man.
About time you took a chance again.
What's love got to do with it? Greg grinned. Are you going to break into song too? Puts!
Ash slugged him on the arm and headed for the fridge, suddenly desperate for one of his dad's craft beers.
Grab me one too.
Greg perched on a stool at the island bench, looking way too knowledgeable and smug when Ashton handed him his beer. So, what are you going to do about Kiara?
I don't know.
Ash took a swig of his beer. It did little to ease the tightness in his throat. If you were a real man, you'd go back in there right now and tell her how you feel. Ash flipped his know-it-all brother the finger. But what Greg said resonated. Elliot had announced to the firm earlier today that he'd made partner. Ash's first instinct should have been to end things with Kiara. Instead, he'd rolled up here tonight and hadn't told her because it hadn't occurred to him until during the drive over that maybe if she learned of his promotion, she'd be the one to end it. She'd never shown any inclination for a longer-term relationship, something he'd never contemplated until 2 hours ago. Yesterday, he'd wanted to push her away. Today, he'd realized that achieving his dream of partnership didn't mean so much if he didn't have someone to share it with. He was turning into a loved-up schmuck like Greg. Just go already. Greg raised his beer in silent cheers before giving him a shove.
You know you want to.
Muttering,
thanks.
He headed back to the library to confront his greatest fear, a relationship with a woman beyond a week or two, only to find Kiara gone. Kiara gritted her teeth all through the rehearsal dinner as she sat next to Ashton, faking smiles and making polite small talk in his parents' formal dining room at a stunning table that easily seated 40 people. Alice had chosen the tasteful decorations, a pretty pastel pink and pearl theme that encompassed everything from the napkins to the understated tea rose centerpieces. Everything looked perfect. Everyone laughed and chatted while she screamed on the inside. She couldn't do this anymore. Pretending to be Ashton's girlfriend had become all too real, and she needed to extricate herself from this farcical arrangement ASAP. Cheers. Ashton tapped his champagne flute against hers, and she forced a smile as she returned the clink. Thankfully, the last speech from Greg, the doting groom-to-be, had finished, and she downed her champagne in 3 gulps. Easy. Ashton laid a hand on her forearm, sending a lick of heat up her arm. She'd missed the undeniable sexual chemistry that sparked between them with a simple touch. I don't want to have to carry my drunk girlfriend out of here. He chuckled at his joke, but his grin waned when she glared at him.
I'm not your girlfriend,
she muttered, her breath whooshing out on an angry hiss. He stared in open-mouthed shock as she pushed back from the table and bolted. She made it as far as the library before he caught her snagging her arm, so she had no option but to stop.
Hey, what was that all about?
Dumb question from a smart guy. She shrugged him off and wrapped her arms around her middle to stave off the sudden chill, making her skin pebble. What do you think pretend time is over? Time to end this charade. The confusion in his eyes gave way to a steely blue. So that's all this has been to you, pretense?
Of course. She snapped, knowing it was imperative that she convince him her lie was real. It's ridiculous to pretend otherwise. She scored a direct hit, flinging his callous words back in his face. He blanched and took a step back. You overheard my conversation with Greg.
I did, and it was most enlightening, but I didn't mean it. He held his hands out, palms up, like he had nothing to hide.
I'd had a gut full of his matchmaking rubbish, so I said that for him to leave us alone.
A fraction of the ice surrounding her heart splintered courtesy of his rationale. But this couldn't end well, no matter how hard she dared to hope. A confirmed playboy and a divorce lawyer. What had she been thinking?
This fling had an expiration date from the beginning, she said with a diffident shrug. You have your precious promotion, and the wedding is tomorrow, so we're done.
What if I want more? Desperation laced every word as he reached for her, but she sidestepped around a mahogany bookshelf. I can't lose you.
You already did the moment you coerced me into taking part in this stupid charade in the first place for your personal gain.
Shell-shocked, he leaned against the nearest cabinet like she'd kicked him in the guts. Good. Now he'd know how she felt every time she'd be forced to see him at family gatherings in the future. Knowing she'd fallen hard for him, yet he'd seen her as nothing more than a plaything.
Kiara, please. I care about you.
No. With pain gripping her chest in a vice, she glared at him with feigned disdain before walking away. Ashton felt like an overstuffed penguin standing next to his brother under the ostentatious gazebo on the fringes of their parents' lush garden. No way would Kiara have had anything to do with these over-the-top flowers. She hated all this frippery. He should know. After she'd left the rehearsal dinner, he'd tried to apologize by organizing a late-night delivery of long-stemmed roses with a gift basket laden with champagne chocolates and body lotion, and nada. According to Greg, who'd heard it from Alice this morning, Kiara thought he was a selfish, egotistical jerk. Ouch. Not that he'd give up. If he couldn't convince her romance was real on the mushiest day of the year, Valentine's Day, at a wedding he'd happily hand in his Y chromosome and admit defeat. As the string quartet struck up a muted bridal march, Ashton craned his neck in anticipation. His first glimpse of Kiara, wearing a bright blue silky halter dress, literally snatched his breath away. With her hair piled high on her head like loosely coiled copper, her eyes smoky, and her lips slicked vivid pink, she looked amazing, stunning, memorable. That was the kicker. He couldn't forget her no matter how hard he tried, so he'd finally given in and admitted the truth, albeit to himself. He didn't want to forget her ever. He willed her to look at him during the ceremony, during the bride strolling up the aisle amid reverent sighs, during the vows, the exchanging of the rings, the kiss. But she didn't glance at him once. So he bided his time up for the challenge, nabbing her after the interminable photos where she'd gritted her teeth so hard her jaw jutted at having to pose with him. You're standing too close, she said, elbowing him when he tightened his grip around her waist. Smile for the camera. He planted a soft kiss shy of her mouth as the photographer snapped a picture. She sighed. You're not going to give up, are you? It's not my nature. He bent his head to murmur in her ear. Give me 5 minutes to convince you I'm crazy about you.
You're playing crazy, she muttered, but allowed him to take her hand and lead her away from the wedding party. If this didn't work, nothing would. As they rounded the towering hedge near the pool house, she balked. You think you can sway me with sex? She yanked her hand away, but his grasp on hers tightened. Trust me, he said, pushing open the door to the nook where they'd had their first memorable encounter. Why would I trust you? Oh. For the first time since they'd met, she was speechless, staring at him in open-mouthed shock. I hope this proves my intentions are honorable and that I'm completely, utterly falling for you. When she tore her eyes from the 5x5-meter banner that read binding and legal document for the cohabitation of Kiara Hastings and Ashton Cromwell on the grounds of irrefutable evidence of mutual compatibility, signaling a commitment to their ongoing relationship, he glimpsed tears. You're serious? Absolutely. He pulled her into his arms, his throat tightening with emotion as she hugged him tight. You have a cynical, analytical, legal brain, so I thought the only way to get through to you was using legalese. When they eased apart, her grin made his heart soar. Where do I sign? On the dotted line, of course. He rolled his eyes. And you call yourself a kick-ass lawyer. She laughed, a purely joyous sound that made him believe in a lifetime of happiness together.